Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you this summer evening to the Danube Institute, and to say I think we are going to have an extremely fruitful evening, partly because we have two distinguished people conducting a debate and discussion between themselves initially, and then broadening that to an audience which includes a number of our friends and fellows. Catherine Brodsky in the front row is somebody who's joining us for the second time as a fellow, so I want to welcome you back. Stephen Klimchuk-Mason, who has been a friend of the Institute for some years and is the author of a book examining the concept of Kanzuk, or that is to say, a particular close security and economic relationship between the countries of Canada, the US, the UK, and New Zealand. And Anthony O'Hare has just joined us for the second time as a fellow. He's the former editor of the magazine Philosophy, and a distinguished philosopher in Great Britain. Until recently, professor of philosophy at the private university. Oh, you still are? Okay, not yet previous. Well, welcome. So we have the basis here of a very good discussion, not only from the platform, but also responding later from the floor. So I'd like to welcome you. Now, our guest is Professor Stokes. The range of interests of Professor Stokes is really very remarkable, and in particular, he has been a distinguished academic expert on military and security questions, which is one of our major interests. We have every year we have a summit on geopolitics, and I hope next time we're able to find you there as well. He's an expert on the linked topic of energy, since energy is now one of the major preoccupations of geopolitics. And he has recently extended his interests in a very important way by writing a book that examines critically, and I think more than critically, with effective criticism. His book has received strongly favourable reviews. Has examined the concept of the decolonisation of the British universities, which is both, I think, an absurd thing, an influential thing, and finally a damaging thing. And yet, as so many other policies that are absurd and damaging, has received an astoundingly easy reception in the world. And I think at the moment, I read in the latest New Statesman, in a piece by John Gray, that the tide of wokeness is turning. Well, I hope that is true, but I've heard that said several times before. And I think that as yet, it has not turned very far. I hope, therefore, John Gray, whom I respect and like, will not prove to be a King Canute on this question. The interlocutor for Professor Stokes is our good friend Callum Nicholson, who came here first as a fellow, has since gone on to great things, but who we welcome back gratefully from time to time. So let me hand over for this Socratic dialogue to Callum to begin it, and later on I believe he will include all of you as well. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming along, and thank you to Doug for coming all the way out from Exeter. So, as John said, Doug is a professor of international relations and the director of the Centre for Advanced International Studies at the University of Exeter, and he's also a senior advisor at the Legatum Institute. He's formerly been the director of Exeter University's Strategy and Security Institute, and was also a former senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. He writes for a lot of outlets, The Times, Telegraph, Spectator, the Daily Mail, But obviously we're here today to talk about your latest book, which is Against Decolonisation, on the rise of this decolonizing movement and rhetoric to be found in many places, but I think it's particularly bad in the UK recently. And I think the basic interesting tension in this, in the book, is, or frankly in reality as well in the UK, is on the one hand, at the moment, the UK is a very successful multiracial democracy and a very tolerant society, and particularly the universities are quite tolerant. But at the same time, the nation is having this sort of self-flagellation over how prejudiced it is. And then nowhere this is more intense, I think, than in the universities. It's an interesting paradox. I just want to cite one stat in the book that I thought was really interesting, which you said that in a 3.5-year period, I think from 2016 to 19, during which time there were 9.2 million students that passed through UK universities, 0.006% of students reported incidents of racial harassment and 0.05% of staff, which seems low. So it's interesting that there is this moral panic, and you use the term moral panic a lot in the book over these sorts of issues. So I got a few questions, and really just for a discussion, then we'll open it up to a discussion with the floor. But at one point you mentioned another statistic, and I think you said that in the last 10 years, terms such as racism and white supremacy in the UK media has increased on average by, in terms of racism, 769% in the last 10 years, and over almost 3,000% reference to the term white supremacy. And I'm wondering, what do you think accounts for that in the last 10 years? What's happened in the last 10 years?
Well, first, I'm really happy to be here. This is a fantastic place. Danube Institute, been so welcoming, and what a wonderful city this is, Budapest. So thanks, Callum. I think what it really is, it comes down to various factors, not least of which is a sort of Trump derangement syndrome. I think that's a big part of it. I think that the discourse of racism has really been used to drive forms of progressive politics, and it follows a sort of saviour script in many ways. And I think that the terms of racism, the way I see racism in the UK at least. UK is a very successful multiracial democracy. Racism, in terms of overt racism, has been driven out. Like 40, 50 years ago, you had skinheads and overt racist violence. That's practically non-existent, frankly, and completely non-existent, frankly, almost non-existent, thankfully. So I think that unfortunately, a lot of left-wing politics, it works on the basis of the generation of moral panics. And then technocratic progressive elites are going to come in and say, we'll get to define what these panics are, and then get to save the alleged victims of these things. And I think that's a very strong moral script you see all the time, and it's backed up by major institutions. Universities are part of that story, the media, etc. I think the mask is coming off. People are seeing through it more and more. But in terms of why did I write the book? And this is an important question. The reason I wrote the book is because we saw these moral panics. There was an alleged epidemic of racism across British campuses. Now I go down British campuses, right? Very multiracial. If you saw like white skinheads or neo-Nazis marching through campus, goose-stepping through campus, I think you might have a slight point there. They're the most progressive, liberal, almost monocultural in terms of left liberalism. So there was a kind of the narrative of racism and ubiquity of racism on British campuses was completely out of whack with the reality. So for me, it was about this process of discovery. How do we account for the fact that we have these charges and of that universities are deeply racist institutions, and we have to decolonize these institutions, and how do we reconcile that with the reality on our campuses? The instances of racism are when you look at the actual data, statistically irrelevant. They're so small, and then accompanying these charges of racism and the need to decolonize the curriculum, which is a highly authoritarian move, by the way, is technocrats essentially pushing an ideology and saying we can't teach this, we can't teach that. You've got to expunge white people and white men from your reading list and stuff like that. But there's also a very technocratic Orwellian move, and I think this is the big spur for me. I hate bullies, and I'm naturally quite anti-authoritarian. I don't like people telling me what to do. And so what you saw on campuses was this kind of introduction of highly totalitarian concepts, very similar to the Soviet Union, I suspect. One of them, for example, is, you've all heard of unconscious biases, I don't doubt. Has anybody ever heard of microaggressions? A few nodding heads in the room. So this is one of the most Orwellian concepts I've ever heard. It's something straight out of 1984. So a microaggression basically is essentially an instance where an alleged victim feels that you've victimized them in some way, and so you look at the data, and a lot of the data that's produced to reproduce the argument that UK universities are deeply racist, and the principal way they do this is they talk about the ubiquity of racial microaggressions across UK campuses, and they give some examples of these racial microaggressions. Shall I give you a few? So one of them that they used was students were feeling racially victimized by the way that, this is a direct quote, the body language and demeanor of university professors, the way you stand was an example. Another example that EHRC used, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is the key quango responsible for laying down the governance structure for the UK's Equality Act. When they speak, every public institution jumps, and they ask, how high do we need to jump, by the way? The EHRC, they produced these kind of terrible reports all about microaggressions. Another microaggression, a black student was in a lift, and a white student went to get in the lift, but they changed their mind and used the stairs instead. And this black student felt that was because of the racism of the white student, and that was coded as a microaggression. Stephen Toop, the former VC at Cambridge. Stephen Toop was a former VC at Cambridge. So he was rickrolled in the end for various reasons. Good riddance, in my opinion. That's just the way it is. He put on this anonymous portal. All universities now have these anonymous portals, but he put this anonymous portal on because he wanted to lead the charge against racism in campuses, where students and staff could grass up these racists on campus. And one of the questions on the portal, one of the ways in which you could code racial microaggressions was a raised eyebrow. A raised eyebrow. So when I see this stuff, raised eyebrows, using the stairs, the way I stand, I think to myself, that's a direct attack on everybody, not just on staff, white members of staff, but also patronising and undermining of the dignity of non-white staff and students on campuses. It's a kind of childish, infantile script. We can come on to, if you want to, Callum, on why we've seen the ubiquity of this ideology and how it ties in with the emergence of technocrats and technocracy in the West. But that's a long answer to your question. I'm sorry about that, but I'm just giving you a flavour.
I've got a few questions that come out of that, but one of them is, we talked before upstairs, and I mentioned how I don't really like the word woke. I think it's become overused. It's become a slogan without much analysis. And the reason I raise it is that when you talked about this, the way the universities are on the one hand the most progressive institutions, but at the same time they're the most self-flagellating. And that makes me think of the Puritans, this very sort of Puritan sense that we're never good enough, we need to keep beating ourselves. And I wonder to what extent we can understand these sorts of movements as a sort of secular expression of sort of Protestant, reformative, extreme movements that are trying to purify the soul in some way. Do you think there's anything in that?
I think there's a lot in that, and I've heard that before, Callum, and as well, and I talk about in the book. If you look at now woke is a useful shorthand, but really what it refers to is underlying it is a kind of postmodern, post-structuralist, post-colonial intersectionalism. We can unpack the philosophical and theoretical elements if you want at some point. It's entirely up to you. But but woke's a useful shorthand. But I think that if you look at where wokery has really emerged the most, it's in the Anglophone, mainly Protestant or post-Protestant Western nations, and in particular America. and the UK. We've got it on steroids in the UK. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that if you look at a lot of the woke ideology, it very much follows a secularized post-Protestant theological script. The original sin, we all know what the original sin is, right? Whiteness is the original sin. How do you atone for whiteness? You become an ally. You become reborn as an ally to the great oppressed intersectional matrix of oppression. You bow down. You get on one knee. Yeah. So you, and then the ubiquity of these intersectional sins it floats in the air. Racism is everywhere. Sexism is everywhere. Transphobia is everywhere. It's everywhere you go. And the only way you have to become conscious and reborn as an ally. So and then you think about the moral certainty of it too. It's very much about it's not black or it's not grey. As you get older, you kind of you realise life's very grey. There's no black and white. There's no but it's very much black and white. The oppressor, the oppressed. It follows this kind of this kind of binary of oppression. Good versus evil. So very much. There's very, very strong kind of religious and theological, secular, post-Protestant overtones to it. Very Calvinistic.
It's interesting because my background's in anthropology, and something I was always interested in was millenarian movements. And millenarian movements are these movements where society thinks we're living in sin, we must confront the oppression or the sin, usually the oppression, and then we must establish the utopia. And throughout the history of Christianity, there have been a number of these millenarian movements. John of Leyden and Munster was a good example of a almost apocalyptic millenarian movement. But I'm wondering, when you look around at society today, at all of these moral panics, it could be the social justice one, which obviously goes beyond racism. There's the sort of sexist side of it, or to do with sexism, or to do with homophobia, to do with, and also the climate one too. All of these, and QAnon as well, actually, to be fair politically, the QAnon movement is structured like an apocalyptic millenarian movement. That in this case, for the QAnon supporters, the sin is, the oppression is the Satanist pedophiles. We must overcome that and confront them. The climate narrative is saying we've sinned against the climate, we must overcome it and establish a utopia. To what extent do you see all of this as you talk about a post-Protestant idea, as a sort of millenarian? Is the sea we're swimming in basically a culture in a millenarian stage?
Well, and the key element of millenarianism is the moment of rupture as well, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Liminality.
When you have the moment of rupture, and then you're liberated. So I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a very strong millenarian element to a lot of this ideology, so it follows that kind of script. But then you have to ask yourself if the definition of the very point of millenarianism is to follow a particular quasi-religious script, and in so doing you bring a rupture which transforms the world, and a new paradise is born in some way, or you're liberated, or you're taken to heaven, or whatever cultural script you wish to follow. What's the moment of rupture for a lot of these things that we can call woke? Well, the moment of rupture is the destruction of Western civilization. That really is the moment that they seek. And all these tributaries feed into this raging river, and you're seeing it now with Israel, Palestine. It all comes together in this kind of this kind of soup. And that is the moment, and based itself on a kind of really odd sets of ideas. Pre-industrial civilization was one of paradise, and we all sat around sipping martinis and cocktails, and it's all wonderful. It also follows a very kind of Rousseauian idea of return to the state of nature. Nature if left alone. So it's anti-industrialization, anti-capitalism, anti-Western. So I think that is the moment of millenarian rupture for a lot of this stuff is ultimately the destruction of Western civilization, the overthrow of capitalism, overthrow in particular of America, the great Satan.
So I read the book, and it's first of all, I really mean this. People should read the book. It's beautifully structured, tightly argued. It's really readable. There was an interesting. You have a good discussion in, I think, the first chapter actually, where you talk about the shift in the Cold War from a Marxist concern for political economy to a postmodern concern for culture and identity. because, and I didn't know this, the political economic argument in developed nations just didn't catch with the people. I wonder if you just talk more about that historical argument you make in the book, because it was really well put, and I think very useful context.
Thank you, Callum. Essentially the chapter you're referring to, it makes the argument that what we had in the West was a transformation of radical social theory in the universities, and in particular the transformation of Marxism from a kind of more materialist critique of capitalism to a more cultural critique. So you've all heard of cultural Marxism, Gramsci, the Frankfurt School. But so that you had that development in terms of, well, why didn't we have a revolution? Germany, for example, was the most advanced industrial capitalist economy, and that went fascist. It didn't go communist. So why aren't the contradictions of capitalism, material contradictions of capitalism, leading to a natural revolution and a socialist transformation of society? So the narrative that then emerged from that was, well, because of culture. Ultimately, the working class are brainwashed dupes, or it's media, or it's culture, or there are cultural narratives and discourses that interpolate the working class into sort of pre-existing ideological categories. So it was essentially Marxist theory, in particular Louis Althusser, who was a very interesting philosopher from the 1950s, sort of generated this idea of kind of the sort of ideological state apparatus, etc. But then there was a radical move in Western social theory as a critique of Marxism. This is why, critique of Marxism, in particular Foucault and Derrida, but they basically rejected a kind of hierarchical conception that you see in Marxism, top-down. There was no ruling class. Power then became circulatory. Power became internal to forms of ideological and discursive ways of seeing the world. So power then, it was very almost a Nietzschean conception of power, away from a Marxian conception where a ruling class imposes its power, to a Nietzschean conception where power is circulatory, internal to discursive structures, ideologies themselves. So you saw that move. So you can see that now, how these ideas have percolated out into Western culture, whereby there's no truth. So essentially, in the postmodern framework, there is no truth. Everything is relative. It's a sort of judgmental relativism, essentially, and you can't judge any other culture, or you can't judge any other idea, because you've got no benchmark to do that against. So you see that, and then what that means then for the loss of confidence and the loss of authority in terms of natural arbiters of knowledge. I mean, they lose all authority. If there's no truth, if you accept judgmental relativism, i.e. there is no truth. Truth is essentially, if you say anything, what you're doing is you're not true, you're not right, you're not objective, you're just imposing your will upon me, you're imposing your identity and your way of seeing the world onto me. So in fundamental and inherent to that, I'm getting slightly philosophical now, is a primacy of epistemology. It places the woke dispensation, the post-structural dispensation, it places primacy on epistemology, what we think, and what we think, and the forms of knowledge. And what it ultimately does, it moves away from a very strong and very necessary emphasis on ontology, what actually exists. So essentially, in the postmodern dispensation, the woke dispensation, everything is circulatory to knowledge. We reject the world out there. So in the book, I argue for the value of scientific realism. There is a world out there that exists independently of our knowledge and our consciousness of it. And because the world is real, there are, there's what's called ontological realism. It imposes limits on what we can do. You can't jump out of a 7th-story car park and fly. You can't be a biological man and be a woman at the same time. There's such a thing as reality, material reality. So that's sort of quite a long way of answering your question, but essentially, so the book argues for the necessity to reclaim reality and ontology against this endless form of self-definition and these forms of truths that are just going around all the time, and has really quite profound, broader institutional effects, in particular the undermining of authority and the necessary collation and nodal points of knowledge and authority. That's how we work, basically. Not everybody is equal in terms of what they know. There are some people, do you see what I mean? So that's what I argue for in the book.
So, I mean, I studied anthropology 20 odd years ago now, and I remember when I was reading anthropology, reading Foucault and Sherry Ortner and all these people, I remember thinking, this is interesting, but it will never jump to the mainstream because it all seems so jargon heavy, the language was so difficult, the theories were so obscure, it seems so distant from practicality. And the UK is I'm British but sort of Canadian, and the thing that I, as a semi-outsider, I always notice is the UK doesn't have much time for philosophy. We're not the French. We want to get on with it. People don't want to hear about abstract ideas. And so I always thought this stuff will never be used anywhere. But it's fascinating how the surface rhetoric of all of that sort of Foucauldian analysis is now the common parlance of well, it's the way people seem to talk even in the news. And what I think is interesting is that it's like that without any of the nuance, because whatever people may think of Foucault is actually a very interesting writer and a very interesting analysis. But what's interesting is that the analysis has jumped to society without any of the complexity and nuance. And I'm wondering if I have a sort of suggestion to see what you think of it, that when Foucault and Derrida and all these people in the 80s, and 60s, 70s, and early 80s, when they were saying that all knowledge is power, we need to challenge meta-narratives, the grand narratives that bind us together, that's all fine as a critique. But now we live in a networked age where you're not just a single person challenging the meta-narrative, but you can find all the other people who are also challenging it, and that creates a new meta-narrative. So what's fascinating for me is the so-called woke narratives, where it started off as a protest against narratives, and it's become now the dominant narrative. And I wonder, this comes back to my first question of what's changed the last 10 years. It seems to me the difference is the internet. Foucault and Derrida didn't understand how their ideas would circulate in a networked age. And that's my sense of why it's changed the last 10 years. But I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think social media and the internet has completely transformed those things. I think it's also there's lots of different reasons why. I mean, on a very kind of like basic level, if universities, humanities and social science departments are increasingly, well, not increasingly, almost entirely monocultural now, in terms of their worldview and their own meta-narratives. I mean, a lot of social science and humanities, and I say this with great sorrow, it kind of, all its theories, they kind of resemble, essentially it's kind of academic theology. And you have to ultimately believe you have to sort of 2 + 2 has to equal 5, and then once you bank the 5, then you can begin to become an academic in many ways. I mean, you scratch away the surface. Well, what do you mean by that? If you question that, you're transgressive. So on a very basic level, if you have that level of monoculture in universities, and they've been pumping out, I mean, think about pumping out hundreds of thousands of graduates. When I started at Exeter, there was in 2013, there were 13,000 graduates. It's now like 36,000, 37,000, 38,000. It's huge numbers of graduates being pumped out. So that itself will have an effect, coupled with the fact that there's been a massive overproduction of the graduate class. If you pump out hundreds of thousands of young, bright people with these kind of ideas, and suddenly the rubber hits the road, and they can't get the kind of jobs that they want. They're making they're kind of barristers, not in the legal sense, but in Costa Coffee. They're not going to get that they're not going to be that happy. So that there is that, and then obviously the internet, and then the final part of the mix, and it obviously is a very complicated cake. There's lots of ingredients here, but I think the final part of it has been this kind of globalization has had all kinds of effects on legacy institutions in the West. And as we've seen the rise of this philosophy, there has been this rise of this new, increasingly supranational technocratic class that rule, and its method of rule has been one of risk, generation of risk, identification of risk, and then risk management of those things. So essentially it's, there's these various social risks and social diseases like racism and sexism and transgenderism, etc., that we identify, and the cure for these social diseases to give us power, and invariably lots of public sector money to cure these things or to manage these things on your behalf. So there is this kind of odd technocratic element to this, and accompanying a rise of public sector bureaucracies and the administrative class in general. So you add all those things together, and you get the kind of, in a classic kind of almost a Marxian sense, an ideological predisposition, given the material reality of this kind of loads of graduates, massive administrative bureaucracies, and then the kind of ideological predisposition that we've got.
I'll come back to that about technocracy a bit later, but but first, though, one thought was that, I mean, look, historically, Britain was a colonizing power, and a part of what colonialism was going to other societies and saying they're not very civilized, we'll give them what we have, Christianity or railways, the telegraph, and so on. And so we imposed on what we saw as uncivilized or savage societies our value set, in a sense. So, but the reason I mention this, and I'm not saying that normatively, whether it's good or bad, but what's interesting, whenever I hear the word decolonize something or decolonize curriculums, what I hear is us, Brits, being colonized by America's moral panics. It seems the act of saying we will decolonize you seems itself a colonizing impulse, because it's someone saying to us, you're not good enough, you're not a good enough person, you should improve yourself. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that's true? Because you talk about moral panics, but I mean, let's be honest, a lot of the impulse for a lot of these things are coming out of the US. The George Floyd incident, you mentioned it in the book a few times, was obviously an interesting sort of spark that lit a forest, like a prairie fire, you know? And it's, but a lot of these, I mean, we had the police in the UK, there were discussions of police violence, but the British police are not armed, or very, very rarely armed. It's not the same country. So to what extent do you feel this call to decolonize is itself a sort of colonizing act? And are the technocrats you mentioned, are they the new pith-helmeted colonialists?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're definitely onto something, and I agree that a lot of this woke, to use that term that none of us like, that we see in the UK has really been the importation of, in particular, of America's racial discourses. I mean, I was born and bred in Hackney in East London, so it's a very one of the most multiracial places. I was an ethnic minority at my own school as a kid, for the vast majority of my school. Very multiracial, very poor as well. So I think race relations are very different in the UK than they are in the US. And we clearly have imported a load of their stuff into the UK, and it's had very negative effects. But then you also think about it, it goes back to your point about social media and the internet. A lot of this stuff really comes out of Silicon Valley. You think about the role, I mean, look, the role of Twitter, Facebook, these social media algorithms, YouTube, they're incredibly powerful, TikTok as well, incredibly powerful in forming minds, forming opinions, and the algorithms are extraordinarily powerful. And it's quite clear, and this goes back to what I first said, when Trump came in, when Trump won, there a lot of very powerful media, big tech companies, this isn't a conspiracy, this is well-established, non-controversial data, saw this as the coming of the sort of the Fourth Reich, almost like a sort of white, so they were pushing, so this EDI, this diversity, equity, inclusion, discourse and ideology, very top level corporate from BlackRock, etc., very powerful elements of American capitalism, big tech, the big funds, really pushed this ideology. I think they were fearful of it. And then you had a kind of similar mini moment in the UK in relation to Brexit, which again was idiotically, in my opinion, seen as some sort of explosion of a sort of nativist white nationalism. It's the most ridiculous idea that I've ever heard. And then you get a lot of people, even today, keep going on about it's some sort of hark back to the British Empire. Well, what the hell are you talking about? It's that's just ridiculous. So I think there were various political moments where a lot of this big tech and these algorithms were deliberately being pumped to sort of try and contain what they saw as the social forces, reactionary social forces emerging in the UK and US politics.
Can I just add to this? I mean, I have a question about the concept of decolonization, and the question is, when is the work ever done from their perspective? And the reason I ask it is that it seems to be often when you have these movements that are about purifying, the work of purifying is never really done. You can always get rid of someone, and I'll give an example of why when I hear the rhetoric around some of these movements, I have to say I find them pretty racist. So, for instance, the phrase "colored people," not people of color, but colored people, I knew as a kid that was kind of an offensive phrase. I would never have said colored people. Why? Because it implies that everyone's got color. Apart from white people, they're special. So I always found it inherently quite a racist idea of colored people. The problem was not the word order and the lack of the word of. Now it's just, you should say people of color, but the problem is still there, color. I still find that quite offensive, frankly. And then BAME, black, Asian, minority, ethnic, is similar, because what it's saying is the most important thing about a Nigerian and someone from Japan is not that they're Japanese or Nigerian, it's that they're simply not white. So again, it's privileging the white people in the analysis. The reason I raise these examples is that from the leading edge of progressive sort of woke ideology, you hear these slogans, people of color, BAME. But for me, I can entirely imagine in 5 years that those people are being cancelled who are saying that and having to supplicate themselves before the online mob, apologizing for their racism. So my point is that this decolonizing emphasis, it tends to, well, look, it's not actually conservatives who are being cancelled by them. It's usually people who are probably quite progressive themselves, like J.K. Rowling. Whatever you think of J.K. Rowling as a writer, she's pretty progressive. And she's got some views now that are seen as, she's probably the most controversial character in England right now. By any standards, she's a very progressively minded person. And so, but they're eating, that movement is eating its own. And I'm wondering where you see it end. Will it ever get to the point where they feel there's no more, we have decolonized? Have we succeeded? What would success look like to them?
I don't think success looks like I don't think they care about decolonizing. I don't think they give a toss. What decolonizing is actually about is about power. All this stuff about woke and all these activists and we do this and we want to decolonize and we care about people and blah blah. It's all rubbish. It's all about power. That's what it's all about. They don't care about decolonising the curriculum, really. What they care about is they have got social power over you to control you, tell you what to do, and ideally give them money as they're doing it. All these consultancies, these public sector bureaucracies, these quangos like Stonewall, Advance HE, running these charters. They run these charters. Stonewall, you got this transgender index, you got these big corporations running them to get badged up. Advance HE run their critical race theory decolonising index, universities are running to get badged up. You're paying them tens of thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands of pounds. These people are making out like bandits. Do you think that there's no end point here? It's about money and power. And it's a power play. It's basically them telling you what reality is. The moon is made of cheese, and if you don't believe that, you're a transphobe, or you're a racist, or you're a sexist. That's what a lot of the transgender stuff is about. For me, I have no, if you, I can, but for me, it's about the fundamental principle of reality, and that's why Kathleen Stokes, the subtitle of it is reality, the material, reality matters, or it's, and that's because essentially, if they can get you to like 1984, 2 + 2 = 5, they've got you, and then everything is lost. And this is really about, there's no end point here, liberating the Palestinians, decolonizing the curriculum, accepting this, accepting that. It's about power. It's about them having power over you, ultimately, and ideally, a lot of them giving loads of money in the process. That's what it's about. And as soon as you understand that, you realise what it's all about. They don't care about any of this stuff.
So it's interesting you mentioned power, because something that you mentioned in the book a few times is the way that the left have basically abandoned the working classes. And it used to be that the main category of concern for mobility, social mobility, economic mobility, was class, which is expressed in England through accent and so on. And it's interesting, if you look at the left in England, my term for it is we've seen the ideological gentrification of the left, because now it seems the left is entirely dominated and controlled by middle-class people with middle-class concerns. It could be around race or sexuality or gender or climate, but not things that particularly impact working-class communities on the doorstep in Carnforth or Lancaster or somewhere. And so my question here is do you think there's something in this? Do you think, what happened to class? What happened to the white working class boys who, you mentioned in the book how actually the higher education access of minority groups, including black British students, has gone up dramatically. I think you said from 21% to 45% in the last 10 years or something. But actually, the access of the white working class, particularly males, is being either flatlined or fallen. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to that.
Well, this is quite personal for me because I was born in a really poor working class family. Went to inner city schools, like ghetto schools, basically. So this is why I guess I feel quite strongly about this. I think that the working class have been abandoned by politics in the UK, really, and the Labour Party in particular. I think that what you've seen now is the complete abandonment of those people that don't care about them at all. And it's kind of a dalliance. It's kind of an intersectional theory essentially, and this is the theoretical system that underlies woke, is intersectionalism, and it's all about identity. Go back to your earlier question about BAME people or people coded as that's as a direct result of intersectionalism. And intersectionalism doesn't take you as an individual or as a person. Doesn't even see you as a person. Ultimately, it sees you as a identity characteristic. Whether you're white, whether you're male, whether your sexuality, etc. And that becomes the most important coding of you, essentially. So, as I say in the book, I mean, according to the intersectional woke commissars and ideologues that are pushing this nonsense throughout institutions across the world, in fact, indicative. I mean, if you could have the sons and daughters of multi-millionaires and billionaires in the audience right now, and as long as you were gay or transgender or a woman, etc., essentially, that would be indicative of a form of social progress, because it's no longer about where you're from or your background. In that sense, it's about your identity, or rather your imposed identity, which itself is incredibly patronising and quite scary. I mean, as a gay person, or as a non-white person, a black person, for example, are you constantly thinking, theorising yourself in terms of your race? I don't think you are. It's a very, very odd mix. But so you see this all the time. I think that, but this goes back. My wife always tells me off, and she says, "You've got to be more positive." So I'm going to try and be a little bit positive towards the end. I don't know how much longer we've got left, but I think that that my big thing also is that, and I talk about this in the book. What I don't understand is if progressives really want a progressive dispensation, where are you going to get more of a progressive dispensation than in the West, particularly in the Anglophone West, right? In terms of equality before the law, the capacity to vote, security, all those things. And what they're doing is they're ultimately cannibalizing liberalism. And they're destroying kind of liberal values, I think, really, and in the context of a rising authoritarianism across the world. So I think that is the kind of the geopolitical moment that we need to be conscious of too.
It's interesting you mentioned that last point about the classical liberal values, because Martin Luther King, of course, said, I dream of a day when my daughters will be judged on nothing but their character, not the color of their skin. But he'd probably be cancelled today for saying that, to say that character is what matters. Also, I remember I saw a tweet like 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago now, and someone tweeted, it was at the height of the George Floyd movement, and this person tweeted saying, if 10 years ago you asked me, or even 5 years before, like 2015 or 14, if you'd asked me to give 10 words to describe myself, straight, white, and male would not have been 3 of the words. And he says, I don't think it's progress, they now would be, which is interesting. But I have one last question before we open it up to the floor, and it's maybe a bit of a challenge, actually, to your argument as well. So you talked about in the book how these movements, there was the Marxist movements that then were turned into the sort of postmodern movements concerned with identity and culture, and that these movements are basically left-wing progressive movements. But I wonder sometimes if all of this social justice stuff we're seeing is just a expression of neoliberal economics. I mean, neoliberalism is about becoming a more efficient economy, a more efficient entrepreneur, but also it affected other areas of the culture. I mean, in the 1980s, you saw gym culture emerge because we became entrepreneurs of our body, perfect your body. That's also where you saw eating disorders take off because women are under the same sorts of pressures. But it seems to me we've had this sort of neoliberal idea the last 10, 15 years in the age of the internet of perfecting yourself morally. And I wonder if we can see the woke thinking as sort of handmaidens of neoliberalism, because I just want to give 4 very quick examples. One is when Hillary Clinton said that basket of deplorables, about people who vote for Trump, sort of work, typically blue-collar, middle, Central Americans, not Central, but Middle America. Really what you're doing is, by saying they're a bunch of racists, you're dismissing the legitimate grievances they have when all their jobs went overseas through neoliberalism. You also have within corporations, it used to be HR, we all understood HR works for the man. But now this idea that HR actually represents moral values, checking for racism in the workplace, is a weird sort of neoliberal way to keep the employees scared and therefore insecure. Third example is, if you look at underserved, say, African American communities in the south side of Chicago, which I spent a bit of time there, a lot of the problems they have is the downsizing of public facilities due to sort of neoliberal concerns that the only thing that's valuable is the price of something. And the final example is, of course, these corporations are sort of laundering themselves, their reputations, by saying we're associated with all the virtuous causes, so don't pay attention to the externalities of capitalism, I guess that Marxists would say. So my point is, all this woke stuff seems to me, people often talk it as left-wing and Marxist. I wonder if it's just an expression of a sort of hyper-capitalist neoliberal economy.
Yeah, I kind of touched upon that in the book, and there are actually some very interesting kind of, I guess, what you'd see as an old-school Marxist thing. There's one called Catherine Liu, who did a great book called Virtue Hoarders, where she talks about that. And there's Philip Cunliffe as well in the UK, who's done some great work on sovereignty and Brexit, and he comes from a similar kind of I guess, materialist critique of woker and makes similar kind of arguments. So I think I would largely agree with that characterization. I do think that a lot of this is about it's kind of neoliberal capitalism, I guess, but also meets this kind of deeper cultural and philosophical undercurrent of self-definition and the primacy of identity. And the way through process of consumption we can signal, ourselves and that kind of thing. All of which really does go back to your point just earlier on about what this does mean for politics, in particular the masses, the working classes in various countries, in terms of being locked out of this. Not just locked out of the economy in some senses by globalization, offshoring of jobs. But when they critique that, they're castigated as unreconstructed racists, deplorables, gammons, and so essentially a lot of this stuff now you see about managing disinformation and managing the rise of populism is really about managing, in many cases, the legitimate grievances of ordinary people against the cultural and economic excesses of a specific type of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, if you want to put it in those kind of terms. So we have both a political economy, but we also have a sort of a cultural economy too, which they feel increasingly alienated from.
That's enough questions for me, I think. So any questions from the floor? Please go ahead, the gentleman in the second row.
Yeah, thank you. In your book on the decolonisation, do you consider the effects of decolonisation of what used to be the colonies at all?
Yeah. So the way I kind of think about decolonisation is I don't look at the process, the actual political process of decolonisation, which was, the unravelling of the former European empires across the global south, process of state formation and post-colonial state formation. I don't look at that. It's not a book about those processes. So, but the way I understand decolonising and the way I theorise decolonisation is in particular in relation to the rise of this ideology, in particular in the university context. So there's a difference between the formal process of political decolonisation, the unravelling of the European empires, and then the way in which using post-colonial theorists like Edward Said, there's been a rise of a decolonising ideology, which in my opinion is completely out of whack with the process of political dissolution of the European empires. I think that the two, because essentially the Saidian, the post-colonial critique, is an ideological critique. It says although these empires have long since gone, there are these residuals of these ways of thinking that still remain in the West, and therefore we have to continue this mission of purity. So there's a distinction there.
Actually, just one question just behind Anthony.
Thank you. A lot of very interesting thoughts. I just want to make one point about Puritanism and Calvinism, which I will defend, in the sense that, and I'm being serious, I do think that Jansenism is pretty well true. I think Pascal is a very deep thinker and an important thinker. But these people, Calvin, Pascal, Jonathan Edwards, these people thought they were deeply sinful. And although they did sometimes, well, so obviously there are Calvinistic movements where people were more or less separated into the sheep and the goats, but the sheep thought they were sinful, and the sheep thought they needed God's grace. And those two crucial aspects of Calvinism I don't see in these modern deformations of it. And just to give a final gloss, Callum talked about millenarian movements. Yes, that is true. But they didn't read the book of Revelation properly, because the book of Revelation says that the new Jerusalem descends from heaven. It is not made by us.
Well, I was wondering actually with that, if I just say, I feel a lot of the what's happening at the moment is sort of inverting a lot of the assumptions. So we've replaced God with ourselves in a sense. And it's interesting that I think Christianity, if you look at this post-Christian culture, which is still structured in a Christian manner, the one thing it seems to have lost is a central element of humility. We've replaced humility with hubris, because all of these things are quite hubristic movements. Maybe that's the difference. But you mentioned the millenarian movements and the liminality, and often the norms are inverted in those periods where if it was one thing before, it becomes the opposite. Maybe that's something about that.
I mean, you could also potentially, you could make the argument too that what we call woke is a form of hyper-liberalism. And if the subject of liberalism is ultimately the individual and process of self-affirmation, then the individual is at the heart of this sort of secular Calvinism. You know, it's about the endless discovery of the self in a playful way. And so the self ultimately becomes God, perhaps. Yeah.
Stephen, is it?
Thank you very much. So I'm based in Canada, where we're pretty far down this path in terms of legislation that may have you criminalize thought crime. In fact, if we go a lot further down that path, I don't know that I'm going to stay in the country. I don't think actually we're going to go all the way down that route. But it does seem to me that Paris may have had its 1968, but that the kind of pathologies we're talking about are particularly virulent in the English-speaking countries. And I'm wondering if you could comment on whether this is being transmitted to other cultures, for example, even in continental Europe. So I'm not a great fan of President Macron in France, but when he says that France will not permit statues to be torn down or inscriptions to be defaced on monuments, it seems to me that they're on a somewhat different path.
I mean, I wouldn't. It's not an area of profound expertise for me, but I think it's fairly safe to say that most of what we've discussed today is very strongly prevalent in the Anglophone world. And France is an interesting example. They've got quite authoritarian state. They don't muck around in France. So I think you've got that too. But there's a deep irony here, and that is most of the philosophers and theoreticians of this stuff have originated in France. So, you know, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Edward Said was educated, I think, I think it was Sorbonne, but in Paris at least, in France. Even a lot of the post-colonial revolutionaries and leaders were left France, and, you know, like Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, etc. So there's a very interesting kind of dynamic there, whereby France exports these theories and philosophies that then seem to sort of, you know, lead to quite profound transformations, at least in the Anglophone world.
I'm just wondering if maybe the problem wasn't the French philosophy, but the translation. We needed better translators. I actually had a thought on that, though. It seems to me that the movements are, first of all, very Protestant movements. So my area is more on the climate phenomena. my role in Budapest, I'm the director of the Climate Policy Institute. And it's very interesting, if you look at the impulse towards the concern for climate change, it's very millenarian, and it's not coming out of Confucian culture or Hindu culture or Islamic culture or Orthodox culture or Catholic countries even. It's coming out of the Protestant nations. It's not total coincidence that Greta's a Swede, and that there's countries like Canada and so on that are very preoccupied with these things. So it seems to be very Protestant, particularly Anglo. But I'd add one other thing that I think it is that actually, and I'm a Brit I'm Scottish actually, who grew up in Canada and lived in Wales for a while, and my family spent some time in New Zealand. All those countries have something in common. They are the little brother to bigger Anglosphere metropoles. Canada to the big brother America, Scotland and Wales to England, New Zealand to Australia. What I remember from Canada as a kid was it was pretty, no offense, it was a pretty backward, redneck sort of place where I was, even near Montreal. What they've gone is they've gone from one form of, small-mindedness in a sense to a new form of small-mindedness. It's kind of not a nouveau riche, but a nouveau ideological, nouveau virtuous maybe, I don't know. They've overcompensated. When I was in Scotland in the 90s, they were the same, but look at them now. New Zealand in the 1990s was, you went there, it was pretty hick, and now it's gone the other direction. So I wonder if it's kind of like an overcompensation you find, because the big metropoles, England and the United States, they've got a mixture of ideas. But the way you see the real strong ideologies is always the periphery Anglosphere countries, it seems to me. Canada to America, England and Scotland and Wales to England, New Zealand to Australia. At least that's my observation. John.
I'm actually interested in the relationship between the decolonisation that had started in the 60s in Africa and so on, actually a little before that in India, but and the idea of decolonisation as it's been applied in academic life and elsewhere in England, because after all, it's only in the last 4 or 5 years that this particular idea, metaphor, has come to be used. And before that, a lot of the other ideas were there, but they were not put in this particular frame. So that's the first point. The second, so I'm interested in how this happened. Secondly, I'm interested to what extent the actual experience of decolonisation of the first kind is having any influence on the decolonisation movement. Because one of the things that strikes one is that those countries which decolonized most violently, and those countries which subsequently became, so to speak, anti-neo-colonial and wanted to reduce as far as they could their role as comprador nations and subservience to neo-colonialism, they've tended to do much worse economically and sometimes socially and politically than the other countries. And on the question of violence in that regard, the first time I read The Wretched of the Earth by Fanon, I thought this is complete nonsense, and it will not only have bad effects, but insofar as people believe it, there'll be people murdering each other, which seems to be now happening. It wasn't original to Fanon, because if you look at what the Irish revolutionaries were saying in 1916, they were saying, we want to have a violent break with Britain because simply receiving power from Britain constitutionally would mean they still remain British in some profound sense. And I think the experience of Ireland in this regard has been a horror show. But has any of these bad experiences influenced the way the decolonizers now talk?
You touched on this in the book, I think, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's well, Said is an interesting one, because a lot of this comes from Edward Said, and part of what I touch upon in the book is he's a very interesting thinker, but he only ever really considers the European empires. And it's something of a frustration I have is this idea that the West, or the European empires at least, are the kind of the key actors of history, which I think sort of undermines other civilizations and empires.
It's quite an ethnocentric idea.
It's a very ethnocentric, incredibly ethnocentric idea, and I say this in Hungary. So it was under Ottoman rule for 150 odd years or so. So there have been numerous empires throughout history, in process of state formation, and often involved in various forms of slavery and other forms of human tragedy. So, but Edward Said, I quote this in the book. Somebody asked him, well, why don't you look at, for example, the Ottoman Empire or the various African slave kings or anything like that? And he says, well, mainly because I speak French and I kind of lived, but I lived in the US now, so I understand the culture more, and it has a deeper literary tradition. So it's that struck me as a slight cop out. So there does seem to be a sort of slight, almost Euro. The irony is there's a very kind of Eurocentric narcissism to a lot of this decolonizing ideology, where it essentially once again reaffirms Europe's primacy as the locus of world history, which undermines and denudes the agency of non-European civilizations, cultures, states and empires, and also is very presentist insofar as it's, well, not even presentist, it's kind of like short history. I mean, the empires haven't stopped. I mean, we've got the American empire, we've got the formation of a Chinese empire now. Some would argue that Russia is seeking, forms of territorial acquisition too. So do you see what I mean? So there is a kind of myopia and almost a sort of Eurocentric narcissism inherent to this, these ideas, where Europe is the be-all and end-all, and history is almost stopped with European colonialism.
It's interesting, actually. It is quite a self-congratulatory narrative, because on the one hand it's saying, this decolonizing narrative is saying that we in the West have attained moral truth, that we know what is right, which is itself quite hubristic, and it's self-congratulatory. But also, it's also self-congratulatory in the sense of saying that we've solved all our other material problems. Now all that's left to do is iron out the moral kinks, which is it's very interesting, actually. It's very Eurocentric. Well,
I mean, there's a guy called Pascal Bruckner who did some fantastic work. There's one book, I think it's called Western Masochism. I think that's the title of the book. It's very good, interesting. He's a French thinker too. And he talks about how this kind of sense of European evil is almost, if one recognizes that, then you're on a higher moral plane. In terms of, then you can deconstruct yourself and you can sort of atone, but then you can lead. And you do tend to get that. It's like there's this sense that if one recognizes this, then once again you're on a higher moral plane.
Almost above it, like an Archimedean.
Well, you've been cleansed of it, so you've then joined the group, the non-oppressors. You become an ally in some way, and then you're part of this group that will lead humanity to some sort of liberated future. I think that's a very strong impulse that you tend to see.
It's quite an idea almost that we're a culture. It's implied that we've transcended human nature and transcended our fortune, in a sense, that we can step outside of the world that everyone else lives in.
Well, again, it goes back maybe to this argument that this is a form of hyperliberalism, where we're kind of at the end of history and the end of the human project. We just now need to iron out, as you use your term, the moral kinks, and we're good to go. So we've arrived at that place, and as long as we can iron out the cultural kinks and recognise our sin, then we can sort of end this process of liberal self-actualization.
And praise be to us.
Absolutely. Praise be to us. I mean, we're the moral actors of the world.
Are there any other questions? I'm not quite sure how much time have we got, actually. Is it to 6 or to 6:30? Oh, we do. Great, fantastic. Okay. Any other questions?
Hey, so I see this, for lack of a better word, and I don't like the word either, wokeness, as being two sides of it. One is power that you touched on, and the other, to me, seems to be self-flagellation. And you have these, even organizations where one example would be people going for dinner, white women specifically, and, being beat up and having this guilt. Can you talk a little bit about that idea of guilt as it relates to it, and whether that is something that we see specifically as a symptom in particular kinds of societies? Because I don't think you see that everywhere around the world. I think most people would probably laugh at that. But in some parts of the world, which seems to be the more developed, more educated world, we see that happen a lot. And so, where does this sense of guilt come from? Because it makes sense for people to want power, but why do people want to give up their power and, self-flagellate?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways of approaching that question. I think that in the specific example you used, wasn't it incredibly wealthy, very, very powerful white women would invite a black woman to their dinner table, and they'd pay this black woman tens of thousands of pounds, and she would then harangue them, and then there'd be some sort of process of catharsis at the end where they'd recognise their innate sin, and then there'd be an ally then and recognise their white privilege. I think that's the thing.
Yeah, it's like a religious process.
Yeah, so it goes back to this kind of this process of kind of religious catharsis. But ironically, but again, there's also the class element to that too, where a lot of this is really about this kind of often very economically privileged elites doing this stuff. I don't think you'd get any white working class women sitting around their dinner tables, sort of, inviting ethnic minority to tell them how privileged they are. Do you see what I mean? So it is there is a very strong sort of socio-economic aspect to it, and an elite thing. On the guilt thing, that's an interesting one too, because it speaks to that kind of post-Protestant dispensation, and you hear now this term cultural Christianity. So it talks about, Tom Holland did an amazing book called Dominion. I don't know if you've heard that book or read that book, but basically in that book, we think in the UK at least is increasingly quite a secular country, but so much of our cultural DNA is derived from Christianity. Even the idea of equality or your innate humanity is quite an odd one. If you look at most human societies, often desperately hierarchical, slavery is ubiquitous. Human beings don't matter that much. You're kind of disposable, and that still characterises large parts of the non-Western world. So again, the irony of your example is it's so Eurocentric, and it's also very much it's suffused with the kind of class politics too. And I think that is again goes back to a lot of the wokery that we see. A lot of it really is very privileged socioeconomic elites paying this lip service to this ideology, essentially, which is costless, isn't it? Really, I mean, it's so easy to do. I mean, if they were saying, well, you know what, I'd respect this, by the way. They're saying, you know what, I've heard you've had the mange tous and the fillet steaks around my dinner table, and I'm going to make a big difference, and I'm going to sell all of my possessions and empty my bank accounts, and I'm going to give it to you or to the BLM or whatever, or poor communities in Chicago, or I'd respect that, but they don't do that, do they? They don't do that. So it's just like jibber jabber. It's just like it's jibber jabber. And then they're being filmed, and then afterwards they go to the dinner party. Oh, Jemima, I had that woman around. She's so insightful. She inspired me, and I'm now recognised my white privilege. Oh, you did it. I did it too. I did it last month. It's wonderful, isn't it, Jemima? Do you see what I mean? So it's this milieu, and problem is most people see this and they are disgusted by it, and they think it's absolute nonsense. And the big issue is this. What is this doing to the social contract in the West? What is this doing? Ordinary people are watching this stuff in the UK on the BBC, the Doctor Who thing. I don't know if you followed this Doctor Who thing. They're watching this stuff all the time. They're seeing their institutions. The BBC is a state. They're forced to pay the telly tax to fund the BBC. So you have these privileged media organisations, these quangos, these public sector bodies, all on the teat of the public sector, pushing this nonsense. And ordinary people, there's a disconnect. They're voting for conservative governments. They're voting for conservative policies. They are open. They're tolerant, very tolerant, and they say we've opened our country up to the waves of immigration. And then, broadly speaking, they're very tolerant of that. But But now, essentially, we've literally got to get on our knees. We've got to watch our culture and our country be denigrated, be repudiated, and being told by privileged elites that we're scum and worthless and gammons and deplorables. So my question is this. What's that going to do to the social contract and politics going forward, given that where we are is not natural? Liberal democracies aren't natural. Liberal values aren't natural. Tolerance is not a natural condition of the human condition. It has to be defended and made and defended and loved. It's a precious and fragile thing. So these people are destroying that, and they're dining out on a dispensation and an international order that's been underpinned by American power, and that's also in flux too, and that's going in a strange way too. So these people are really destroying something very special, very precious, and I think it's going to lead to massive reactions in Western politics.
So a comment on it, this idea of people who have no power. I'd actually say that probably the surest sign that someone probably has a lot of power is that if they can perform publicly that they don't. And it's kind of a luxury of actually having systemic power, I suppose, in a sense. And this is where I would agree with the systemic structural power, in a sense that it reminds me a bit of Jainism. There's an Indian religion, and the Jains spend all their lives, they're jewelers, and they spend all their lives building up enormous wealth. And then when they get to a certain age, they renounce all of their riches, and they walk around as a pauper, begging for the last 15, 20 years of their life. Now, of course, there was a joke about them that, what's the difference in them and actual paupers? It's like, well, it's their choice to do it. And if they're not just homeless paupers and beggars, they're Jains, and so they had the wealth to give away. And there's kind of a potlash element to this, of burning your riches to show your power.
Yeah, I mean, it's about social status, right? I mean, ultimately, all human beings are status-orientated, right? Essentially, you're going to want a nice car, but the car you could have a Porsche and it could drive just the same as a banged-out old Ford, but because it's a Porsche, because it has a certain social status, you're going to want that more. So you could say the same about opinions, and these kind of it's status signaling. It's high opinion, high status signaling, and I think that's a big part of what's going on too.
Just one very quick thing. When I was 20, I worked as an intern in a law firm in London at Allen & Overy. And Allen & Overy used to be in an old bank, and it was an octagon-shaped building, so you could look down into the car park. And the entire car park was filled with Ferraris or high-end cars with all the partners. But there was one banged-up old Toyota. And I said, "Who's that?" I said, "Oh, that's the head of the senior partner's car," because he had all the power, so he could have the worst car. Everyone else needed to show their status, and he showed his status by not bothering. Different techniques. Melissa.
The allegorical tale of the Benin bronzes come to mind, and I'm wondering what was the reaction to that I'm talking about, where all of the museums in the US and the UK and maybe others were bending over backwards to get these bronzes back to Nigeria. And then some clever German metallurgists did testing, and they determined that the bronzes were actually made from the object that was traded for slaves, and they melted it down. So they made the bronze from the currency, quote unquote, that they received for slaves. They were slavers. And these didn't go back to the people of Nigeria, but into private hands. And at that point, I think everyone paused, but I've not heard what happened. But I think it's a nice illustrative tale.
Well, that's a really good observation. In the book I mentioned this, I talk about this as well, because if you think about, to stick with the sort of the theological script that we've been discussing, the original sin of the West or the UK is slavery, transatlantic slavery. Although it only lasted for 200 years, and then there was a massive campaign to end slavery in the colonies, and the abolitionist movement, which itself was emergent from the Christian tradition, etc. But the irony was that the picture is painted as a very one-dimensional fake history, ultimately. pre-colonial Africa was massive. There was a massive Arab slave trade that predated the European contact with the slave, but also pre-colonial Africa, pre-European contact Africa was characterized by massive black slave kingdoms, as was many of the sort of white parts of the country. Slavery has been ubiquitous throughout human history. So this is a completely non-controversial fact. The biggest, by number, the biggest slave trader in human history was a guy called Tipu Tip, who was an Afro-Omani slaver that basically controlled Zanzibar. The biggest slave societies in human history, one was called the Kingdom of Dahomey in Nigeria, and one was called the Sokoto Caliphate, also in modern day Nigeria. Millions and millions of it's a black inter-African slave trade. Do you see what I mean? So if we're sending back these precious objects, which may well be a fair thing to do, we have to be cognizant of the true history of Africa, which respects the agency of Africa and Africans. This is the other thing, this simplistic binary narrative of the transatlantic slave trade, which once again places Europe at the heart of human history, which disrespects the history of Africa, the rich history and diverse history of Africa, in terms of, and you get some really weird elements to this too. In 2022, there was a movie done called the Warrior Queen? I thought it was a Hollywood movie done. It was kind of like a Wakanda-like movie of the Dahomey Kingdom. It was a black queen that ran this. The Dahomey Kingdom was a terrible slave. It was like 2.5 to 3 million slaves at its highest point, and they used to have what was called the Festival of Dahomey every year. And this festival essentially involved, it was a Yoruba slave society that basically conquered Igbo. But this festival, to celebrate the greatness of the Dahomey Kingdom, would murder thousands of slaves. They'd line them all up, cut their heads off, and all this kind of stuff, which was stopped by the British, by the way. The Dahomey Kingdom slavery, or the Dahomey Kingdom, was ended by the Royal Navy when they threatened to bomb the ports of the Dahomey Kingdom. Do you see what I mean? So essentially, all this. So we need to be very strongly conscious. This simplistic narrative of the ubiquity of white slavery and the transatlantic slave trade is complete nonsense. Slavery's been. There's more slaves in India today and in Africa today than there was at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. Look at the Barbary slave trade. North African states of the Barbary states of Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, was slaving all across Europe. The first serious naval war that America ever fought. Do you know who they fought? The Barbary slave states. Jefferson. The first major naval campaign of the new America was against the Barbary slave states, because they kept kidnapping and slaving American ships. Interesting history.
It's interesting on the Barbary slave trade, because my understanding is the word slave etymologically is derived from Slav, because the Barbary slave traders liked to enslave Slavs because Slavs were hardworking and docile, according to them. Oh, this is my Slav, and it ended up being slaves. So it's interesting.
Just to go on the brutality of it, I mean, that a lot of the imbroglio system, or the harem system, a lot of in particular in the Balkans and the East European states that were conquered by the Ottomans, a lot of the women ended up in the sex slave, basically in harems, and a lot of the men were often put on galley slaves. These massive ships put onto to row. The first thing they would do, or they'd act as the Praetorian Guard of the emperors, basically. And the first thing they would always do with the blokes when they put them on the slave ships, you know what the first thing they would do? Castrate them.
Any other questions? Go ahead. Two, go ahead, yeah. Well, we've got 10 minutes.
Second question. I was taken by your passion then, talking about England and the destruction of our culture and everything. Who or what do you think about current alternative voices coming from the podcast realm, if you like Lawrence Fox and Carl Benjamin and Tommy Robinson, etc.? Do you think they've got a chance to fight back to get the English culture back on track?
Well, I've been on the Lotus Eaters, which I think Carl Benjamin is part of, and I've been on a few others, Trigonometry, and so I think that podcast system is a really useful and very interesting ecosystem. And people are voting with their feet. I mean, the viewing numbers that these people are doing are very, very strong. So I think that is a real chink of light, and I think that has really helped to push the cultural narrative in a way which is more diverse. You do really have regime narratives, often from the BBC, which is pushing a very one-sided view. So I think that the explosion of this kind of podcasts and these other forms of social media have been super useful in creating a more diverse and inclusive space for contestation and philosophy and ideas.
And you said your second question as well, didn't you? No, is that okay? John.
Thanks. This is a very straightforward political question. What you've said is, I think, well supported by a great deal of evidence. It has formally been embraced, so to speak, by the Conservative government of the last 20 years, but that government has done almost nothing to actually make the points you make very clearly, or to produce policies that are designed to correct, reverse, or qualify them. What, in your view, explains that? And it can't simply be a civil service which is resistant.
Well, I've worked quite closely with various parts of the Conservative Party, the ministerial machine, number 10 a lot. I worked very strongly on the academic freedom legislation. There was me and a small group of people that pushed that through. And that's been a real success story. But apart from that, it is a fairly barren wasteland. I think there's a number of things. I think first and foremost, the Conservative Party, post the next election, needs a complete philosophical and value reboot of its thinking. I think it's lost in terms of any kind of sets of ideas. I don't think it knows what it's about, what it wants. And I think, for me, conservatism, its meta value has to be the preservation of Western civilization. That's the key value, and within that, basically, are sets of percolating elements. And if you don't have that, you're not a conservative. So I think, and I don't think they've got that. I think they're weak. I think they're stupid. I'm going to be able to rant now, by the way. I think they're weak and they're stupid. I think it's been a deep frustration of mine, all this nonsense about woke all the time. I'm sick and tired of reading Daily Telegraph headlines about some non-entity in the Conservative Party is now going to do diversity in the civil service. They're going to crack down on it. They're not going to crack down on it. Do you know why they're not going to crack down on it? Because in the last 3 months of the Blair government, they passed what was called the Equality Act. The Equality Act is the public sector equality duty, and that legally mandates all public sector bodies to basically push wokery. So, absent the reformation of that law, or the public sector equality duty, you're going to keep getting wokery. So they can jibber jabber all they like about pushing back culturally. So I think to be fair, you had the pandemic, but the big thing is the Boris Johnson government didn't lean into the 2019 Brexit dispensation, and that is a very deep frustration. Basically, what that was all about, it was about rebooting a different type of politics for the UK, post-Brexit politics, about national sovereignty, and about popular democracy, and about ordinary people too. Ordinary people, and they didn't grab that moment. Instead, like a sort of kind of all this flim flam and histrionics, basically, that they blew it. So I think that what's going to happen now is Labour will get in. If Labour have got any strategic sense, they will really dial back on the wokery, because that will kill them overnight. That will really damage them badly. Has Starmer got that? I don't know. We'll see where he goes with that. But a new Conservative Party has got to reboot its values. It's got to basically offer something. It's got to become a working class party. It's got to offer something to working class people, and it's got to be proud. It's got to defend the nation, defend its history, defend its institutions, and it's got to start laying down some lines. People are sick and tired of having, I don't want to swear, but they feel the mickey has been taken out of them, and they've been lied to time and time again. They're watching their culture and their institutions get destroyed, and in a sort of dalliance way, by the way, when they've opened themselves up, they've been tolerant, they've been open, and they've been, I don't want to swear, but they've been not done well. And the Conservative have allowed them to have, they've been weak and stupid, and they need to reboot themselves. And something has to happen, because otherwise the reaction is going to be so strong.
Melissa?
I was just going to say, June the 10th, if you're not busy, that afternoon we're having a conference in London, and you coming and saying just what you said now would be great.
How can I say no to that?
We got 2 minutes left. If it's a very quick question, one more. Go ahead. Teszek.
Thank you very much for very interesting discussion about your book. My first comment is that culture is deeply related to geopolitics, and if the West is using this ideology, the woke ideology, as well as decolonization, you described, it means that it is detrimental to the geopolitical power of the West. And so my question is, especially if we compare this situation in the West with Russia and China, they deeply using the tradition, culture as a foundation for their improvement or geopolitical rise, especially in China. So what would be a chance for the West to restore cultural foundations of its geopolitical meaning or power?
Well, that's a big question, and I do touch upon it in the book. I think that for me, if you think about what a nation is, and if you think, for me, the guiding light has to be the national interest. The national interest, and that can be, broadly conceived. But the national interest is emergent from a deeper story, a deeper cultural narrative about national identity. How do you know what you want as an interest before you know what you are? I think this is why I wrote, another reason why I wrote the book, because the left keeps saying, the culture wars are manufactured. It's kind of manufactured by the media and the conservatives. It's complete nonsense. It's pushing back. Basically, it's about defending an identity, and I think that's the key. Is that you need a sense of an identity to help to give you a sense of where you want to go, who you want to be. And if it's constantly denigrated, if it's constantly repudiated, if you're constantly undergoing a process of cultural and political self-flagellation, you're going to go nowhere. I mean, you think about any great civilization in history, right? It has to have a degree of civilizational confidence, civilizational mojo, a spiritual energy, if you want to put it in those terms. And if you don't have that, then you're dead in the water. It's like depression, you're like going to lie there. You don't know who you are. You can't summon the will to live, and I think that is what the culture was also about. It's about that. Unfortunately, our institutions are pushing this constant process of deconstruction, to deconstruct Western civilization, to deconstruct the West, and ultimately it's almost like a psychological operation to undermine confidence and will. That's how you break civilization. That's how you break people, by the way. You break their will to live. And once you broke their live, you got slaves. So that's why I think a lot of this it touches on that stuff. And this is why I say in the final chapter of the book, this is so dangerous. Because we have had the process, the post-war process of the liberal international order and the American unipolarity with globalization. But we're now in a very much more of a multipolar international system with very powerful states that do not share our values. And where we are at the West in terms of our dispensation is quite unique. And this is not set in stone. So if we don't become cognizant of the fragile nature of what we have and summon the will to defend it against this stuff that we see, the sun will set. The sun will set. And if we buy the idea that Western civilization, in terms of its holding a torch for human progress and human freedom, and I think the data is pretty set on that, it does do that. If we buy the idea, isn't it worth saving? Isn't it worth investing in? Isn't it worth believing in? Do you see what I mean? Especially in the context of a more multipolar international system.
Well, we could end on a better point than that. Thank you very much, Doug, for coming and for the talk and for the book as well. I mean, I really had a good time reading it, so it's a great book. And thank you to everyone for coming this evening. So thank you.